It's the scarecrows I remember most clearly, the image that burns itself behind my eyelids when I try to sleep. There were 5 of them, lined up at the edge of the cornfield, but they weren't doing their job. They weren't facing out to protect the crops. They were all turned inward, toward the old weathered farmhouse like a silent, unmoving congregation. Their forms were crude, tattered clothes stuffed with straw dangling from splintered wooden crosses. But from a distance the posture felt intentional, watchful. The setting sun cast their shadows long and thin, stretching them across the dry, cracked earth until they touched the porch of the house they seemed so fixated on. It was the first thing I noticed, and the first sign that this place was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The silence was the next thing. It was a heavy, oppressive blanket that smothered every other sound. I'd been in quiet places before, but this was different. This was an absence of sound. There were no birds, no hum of insects beyond a few lazy flies, no distant drone of a tractor or the lowing of cattle. A farm, even an isolated one, should be alive with noise. This place was a vacuum. The air was thick and hot, completely still, making the corn stand erect and motionless, a silent army stretching to every horizon. The stillness made my own presence feel like a violation, my footsteps on the dirt path sounding like gunshots in a library. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. I don't usually share this kind of thing with many people, but those who enjoy hearing stories like this understand how some experiences just keep haunting your thoughts. If you're into this too, make sure to subscribe. It really helps me keep sharing stories like this here. My initial plan had been simple: find a phone, get some help. The farmhouse door was slightly ajar, a dark slit in the building's faded white facade. It was both an invitation and a dare. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to take my chances on the empty road. But the thought of spending a night in my dead car, surrounded by this suffocating silence, was somehow worse. So I walked up the porch steps, the wood groaning under my weight, and pushed the door open. You have to understand, I'm not the kind of person who goes looking for strange things. I'm a software developer from Chicago, and my world is built on logic and code. I was driving to the West Coast to start a new job, and my GPS, in its infinite wisdom, had rerouted me onto a series of back roads to avoid some phantom traffic jam. Then my car died. Not a sputter, just a sudden, complete electrical failure. No lights, no radio, nothing. And of course, no cell signal. For over an hour I sat there, stewing in my own frustration, watching the sun get lower in the sky. Not a single car passed. My cynicism was my armor, but out there it felt thin and useless against the sheer, overwhelming emptiness. The decision to walk was one of pure, pragmatic desperation. From the road I could just make out the top of a silo over the horizon of corn. It was the only sign of human life for miles in any direction. The walk itself was punishing. The air was so humid it felt like I was breathing water, and the sun baked the back of my neck. With every step, dust from the unpaved road coated my shoes and jeans. The cornfields on either side of me were impossibly tall, rustling with a dry, papery sound, even though there was no breeze. It created a strange claustrophobic effect, like walking down a corridor with walls that went on forever, trapping me in a world of green, gold, and oppressive silence. My goal was simple and mundane. I wasn't on an adventure. I was trying to solve a problem. I just needed to find a person, use their landline, and call a tow truck. Maybe get a glass of water. That silo represented a return to normalcy, a solution. But as I drew closer, that feeling of relief began to sour. The farmstead came into view, and it just looked still, too still. There was no truck in the driveway, no lights in the windows, no signs of recent activity. What I had mistaken for a beacon of hope from a distance now felt more like an epitaph, a monument to something that was already over. My practical mission was being slowly eroded by a primal sense of dread I couldn't explain. My voice felt alien and loud when I called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" The words just vanished into the heavy air, absorbed by the wood of the house and the sea of corn beyond. No reply came, not even an echo. I stood on the porch for a long moment, listening to the frantic beating of my own heart. The ajar door seemed to be watching me. Taking a shallow breath, I gave it a gentle push. It swung inward with a low, mournful groan that seemed to travel through the entire structure. The air that washed over me from inside was stale and thick, carrying the scent of ancient dust, dry rot, and something else. Something faintly sweet and cloying, like flowers left in a vase for too long. My stomach clenched. It was the smell of decay. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom within. The last rays of the setting sun cut a single dusty beam of light across a living room that led into a dining area. And that's where I saw it. A large wooden table, fully set for a family of 4. The plates were perfectly arranged, with silverware neatly placed on either side, and glasses poised for a drink. But the entire scene was coated in a thick, undisturbed blanket of grey dust. It covered everything. The plates, the tablecloth, the chairs, creating a monochrome landscape of abandonment. It was as if time itself had stopped in this room, and dust was the snow of the intervening years, burying the last moments of a family's life. The food was still on the plates. Petrified remnants of what might have been pot roast and vegetables were now shrunken, blackened husks, draped in cobwebs of fuzzy, dark mold. A pitcher in the center of the table held a dark, stagnant liquid. The sight was so profoundly wrong, so deeply unsettling, that it felt like I was looking at an exhibit in a museum of sorrow. This wasn't a house where people had packed up and left. This was a place they had simply ceased to be. I backed out slowly, my boots silent on the dusty floorboards, feeling an urgent, primal need to get away. I felt like a trespasser, not in a home, but in a grave. Backing away from the house, I stumbled off the porch and onto the dry dirt path, my mind reeling. The image of that dusty, mold-covered meal was seared into my brain. I took a deep, shuddering breath of the thick, humid air, trying to force the rational part of my mind to take control. It had to be a prank, or some strange art installation in the middle of nowhere. Anything was better than the alternative that was starting to form. That's when I heard it, a sound that cut through the oppressive silence. From deep within the cornfield just behind the house, there was a distinct rustling. It wasn't the wind. The air was as still as a photograph. It was a slow, dragging noise, methodical and heavy, like a full sack of grain being pulled between the rows. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound continued, moving slowly, parallel to where I stood. It stayed hidden within the dense stalks of corn, but I could track its progress. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A deer, maybe a wild hog, but the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. It lacked the erratic quality of an animal moving through the undergrowth. This felt purposeful. This felt like I was being stalked. The vague, unsettling feeling of being watched suddenly had a source and a direction, and the sheer density of the corn meant I couldn't see what was making the noise, a fact that was somehow the most terrifying part of all. It was close, and it was watching me. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has ever been through something like this, a moment where the world just stops making sense. That's why I keep sharing these stories here. If you enjoy these strange accounts too, subscribe. It gives me strength to keep bringing more. My last shred of hope was the barn. It was a large, dilapidated structure a short walk from the house. Maybe the farmer was in there, I reasoned, oblivious to everything. It was a flimsy hope, but it was all I had left. To get to it, I had to walk directly past the line of 5 scarecrows. I forced my gaze forward, focusing on the dark, yawning doorway of the barn, but I could feel them in my peripheral vision. Silent, menacing figures standing sentinel. The barn was just as dead as the house. The cavernous space was filled with shadows and the thick, dusty smell of old hay and dry earth. A few rusted pieces of farm equipment lay silent and abandoned. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice sounding small and pathetic in the vast emptiness. Nothing. Defeated, I turned to leave, my heart sinking with the last of my hope. As I stepped back out into the fading daylight, my eyes fell upon the scarecrows again, and my blood ran cold. They had moved. It was a subtle change, but unmistakable. Before, they had all been facing the house. Now, every single one of their crude burlap heads had turned, and they were all staring directly at me. A wave of pure, undiluted panic washed over me. My mind, the logical, problem-solving machine I had always relied on, simply refused to accept the data my eyes were feeding it. Scarecrows do not move. They are inanimate objects. I tried desperately to find another explanation, a trick of the setting sun's light, the angle I was standing at, a sudden gust of wind I hadn't felt, but the air was unnervingly still. The light was fading but consistent, and the geometry was undeniable. They had been looking at the house, and now they were looking at me. Every rational explanation withered and died in the face of that impossible truth. and a cold, primal fear began to take root in its place. My only thought was to run. Forget the car, forget the phone. Just get back to the empty road and away from this cursed place. Survival instinct screamed at me to turn and sprint without looking back. I braced myself, my muscles coiling, but as I glanced toward the path that led away from the farm, my heart seized in my chest. One of them was gone. The post at the very end of the line, the one that had been closest to me, was now empty. A bare, splintered wooden cross stood starkly against the darkening, bruised purple of the sky, a vacant throne where one of the silent watchers used to be. The absence was somehow more terrifying than the movement had been. My eyes darted frantically across the darkening landscape, searching for it, and then I saw it. It wasn't on its post anymore. It was standing, on its own 2 feet, at the edge of the cornfield that bordered the path. It was about 50 feet away, a stiff, lumpy silhouette in the deepening twilight. It was perfectly still, its straw-stuffed limbs held at an awkward angle, but it was undeniably upright and unsupported. It had moved from its cross to the edge of the field, and my mind simply couldn't build a bridge of logic to get from one point to the other. The very laws of physics felt like they were fraying at the edges. I was completely frozen, my feet cemented to the dry earth. It wasn't just fear that held me in place, it was a profound system-crashing shock. My brain was caught in a loop, trying and failing to process the impossible sight before me. The world had gone silent again, the only sound the frantic, hammering drumbeat of my own heart against my ribs. I stared at the thing, this crude effigy of a man made of sticks and rags, and it stared back with eyes of faded black paint. The distance between us felt both infinite and terrifyingly small. The silence was a held breath, a moment of terrible suspense before something awful happened. Then it moved. It took a single halting step forward, lifting one stiff leg and planting it on the dirt path. The motion was not fluid or human. It was a grotesque, jerky lurch, like a poorly handled marionette taking its first step. It was utterly, horrifyingly silent. There was no crunch of straw, no scuff of a boot on the ground, just the impossible, noiseless movement as it stepped out of the cornfield and onto the path between me and my only escape route. The world seemed to shrink to just me and this shambling horror, this walking violation of all that was real and sane. As if the movement itself wasn't horrifying enough, its head, a lumpy burlap sack with a childlike, sinister face painted on it, slowly tilted to one side. The gesture was full of a sickening, unnatural curiosity. It was as if this thing, this collection of farm refuse, was genuinely studying me, trying to understand what I was. The hint of a mind, of some terrible alien intelligence animating that form, was the single most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. It transformed the creature from a simple monster into a thinking, observing predator, and in that moment I understood that I was its subject of interest. The paralysis that held me was no longer just fear. It was the total shutdown of a mind confronted with something it cannot compute. Everything I knew about the world, every solid fact and scientific principle that had grounded my reality, dissolved into smoke. This couldn't be happening. Yet it was. The solid ground beneath my feet felt like it was giving way, plunging me into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The creature stood there, its head cocked, and I felt my own sanity begin to crack and splinter under the weight of its silent, impossible gaze. A coldness seeped into my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching night. It was the chilling realization of my own utter insignificance. I had stumbled out of my world of spreadsheets and traffic jams and into this. A place that operated by a different, older and more malevolent set of rules. I wasn't a lost traveler anymore. I was an intruder. I was prey. The Scarecrow was not just a monster. It was a gatekeeper to a reality I was never meant to see, and I had just walked right through the door without knowing it. The silence stretched, and I knew with dreadful certainty that it was waiting for me to run. Something deep inside me, a primal circuit buried beneath layers of civilized thought, finally snapped. It wasn't a decision. It was a pure, animalistic reflex. I ran. I turned and sprinted away from the path, away from the barn, away from the silent, watching thing that wore the skin of a scarecrow. I didn't dare look back, convinced that if I did, I would see it lurching after me. The only sounds in the world were my own ragged, gasping breaths and the frantic pounding of my feet on the hard-packed earth. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. I ran with the kind of desperate, mind-numbing terror that erases everything else, until I finally burst out of the farm's territory and collapsed onto the dirt road, tumbling into a shallow ditch, shaking uncontrollably. I lay there in the ditch as true darkness fell, the last vestiges of twilight bleeding from the sky. For hours, I did not move, listening to the chirping of crickets and the frantic chattering of my own teeth. The world had returned to normal sounds, but the silence of that farm was seared into my memory. Finally I saw it, the bouncing glow of headlights in the distance. Hope, sharp and painful, shot through me. I scrambled out of the ditch, a disheveled, mud-stained mess, and stood in the middle of the road waving my arms like a madman. A rusty old pickup truck slowed to a halt, and its driver, an old man with a face like a weathered map, peered at me through the bug-splattered windshield with cautious eyes. Gasping, I tried to explain everything. My broken-down car, the house, the table set for a meal that never ended, the scarecrows. The words tumbled out of me in a frantic, incoherent stream. I pointed back down the dark path I had just fled from, trying to make him understand the danger, the wrongness of that place. The old man listened patiently, his expression shifting from suspicion to a strange, deep-seated pity. He looked from my wild eyes to the dark path, and then back again. He took a long, slow breath before he spoke, his voice raspy with age. "Son," he said, shaking his head slowly, "there ain't been a farm down that path in 30 years, not since the whole family disappeared one harvest. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night." His words hung in the air, cold and heavy. I turned and stared down the path, into the bright cone of the truck's headlights. Where the farmhouse and barn should have been, there was nothing. Just an empty, overgrown field, choked with weeds and tall grass, swaying gently in a night breeze that had finally picked up. The entire place was gone. As long as these stories keep haunting me, I'll keep sharing them here. If you want to hear more, subscribe. It really helps keep this space alive.